everyone. Thank you very much for coming out today. This is honestly quite a few more people than I expected, so I really appreciate it. Today I'm going to be taking questions at the Women's Society of Cyberjitsu booth, which is up in front of the business hall. It's not inside of it, but it's right outside, and you shouldn't need a badge to come visit. So today I'm doing a thinly veiled data science and scientific method talk, but we're going to talk about women in cybersecurity and a lot of studies around that topic. And we're also going to use what we learned from some of these studies, the good, the bad, the ugly, but we're going to try to explore some factors that negatively affect hiring, retaining, and promoting women in the cybersecurity field. I also want to talk about a scorecard framework, just a very simple way to think about where these factors are in your organization, identify them, and hopefully be able to reduce or eliminate them. And I'll take a very quick Q&A, but any questions that we don't get to, I'll be happy to talk to you outside. So I did want to tell you what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. So things that if they come up in the Q&A, we're not going to talk about that. I do want to talk about retaining women who are already in the field. That includes women who are interested in the field, women who are studying something similar in the field. But we're not going to talk about getting women interested in cybersecurity. The reason why we're not doing that is it's a completely separate talk. There are a lot of efforts, a lot of classes, and a lot of debate around the best way to do this. But hopefully you're empowered to do a little bit more research after this talk today. We want to talk about why women leave the field. We're not going to accuse people, society, organizations of being sexist. We're not going to talk about eliminating sexism in society, politics, anything like that. I want to keep this scientific and productive. And we're going to talk about using numbers to figure out what is blocking hiring, promotions, training, other opportunities that would encourage women to stay in the field. We're going to talk about science and where data science can't really replace human judgment, because we're talking about a people issue. I mean, yeah, we can measure a lot of things around it, but hiring people is about individuals and interacting with them. We're not going to talk about laws and regulations. So, fair hiring practices, fair pay practices, they vary greatly between different countries. So that's one reason why I don't want to talk about it. But it's also its own talk, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not going to talk about places your kids can learn cyber. I put this up here, though, because I've taught a lot of classes, and I do have a lot of relationships in that field. So if you do want to know, I'll be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. So the first thing that people ask me about when I do talks like this, well, this is my second time doing a non-technical talk about this issue, is what do women actually want? What's important to women? So while digging through dozens, almost 100 studies on this topic, I came across this paper from these researchers in South Africa, and they made a video game to test which features of video games are appealing to women. And they wanted to see, here's these 10 criteria from this pretty well-known book called Gender Inclusive Game Design, and we want to see if women actually choose these features or whether they care about them. So they tested it on 12 to 16-year-old girls. And there were 10 pretty accepted, like you would look at it and be like, yeah, okay, women probably care about this. This is appealing to women. They didn't care about 3 of them. And they were neutral about violence in games. I personally love a violent video game, and I'm sure many of you do too. So that's not going to detract me from playing video games that include violence. They also weren't overly concerned about creativity or collaboration in the video games that they were playing. So I want to make the point here that we could know what individual groups want or what individual people want and what's important to them, but we're not going to know what everybody wants. People are individuals, they'll be outside of the curve, and studies don't account for the exceptional. They can't replace human judgment, and people of all backgrounds can be affected by the same factors that would block women from being hired, treated fairly, and promoted the same way that men would be. So I read a lot of studies doing this kind of research over the course of about 2 years. I also conducted many interviews with recruiters and HR professionals as well, because I work in threat intelligence and threat hunting. I'm not a recruiter or an HR person, and I'm not qualified to speak on that. So I wanted to make sure that I was representing what the common views of HR and recruiting professionals are. So a lot of studies, when I was reading through them, presupposed that women experience bias or discrimination or that they're unhappy. And certainly a lot of the studies that are based out of the United States presuppose that. But a lot of studies that are conducted overseas in Asia, I read a few from France, say that women are excited and empowered in this field because there's flexibility, there's travel opportunities, and there's remote work. And it's not true of every organization, but there are many reasons for women and men to be happy in the field. So I don't want this to be a complete downer about, all women are unhappy or all women are experiencing this horrible discrimination. That's not true. I also noticed that many of the studies had very small sample sizes. One of them had a sample size of 36, and they were making some pretty broad and general conclusions. Anybody with a data science background in here can tell you that a sample of 36 is good if it's representative of the entire population, but 36 women in cybersecurity, I'm not sure that's quite as representative as it could be. And those sample sizes would be better if it was diverse and random, right? But usually the samples were taken from women who were in the same companies or the same clubs or the same organizations. So it wasn't about, let's find people with lots of different experiences. Let's just find the women we know and ask them questions. So the conclusions are still valid about that group, and the information is still useful for us to discuss, but always take it with a grain of salt, that it's not going to apply to all women. And then there are fewer studies around retention and attrition reasons for mid-career women. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So ultimately, we want to answer the question of how do we recruit and retain technical women and grow them into effective technical leaders. One common thing that I see with women in technical fields is that as they go up in their careers, they're less likely to become a technical architect or somebody who's driving technical strategy. And they're more likely to become project managers and people managers. So they may be controlling budgets and staffing for various projects, but they're not a strategic technical leader. So we want to increase that as an industry, at least I hope we do. But we want to answer the question about how we can remove factors early on in somebody's career so that they can gain the skills to be that technical leader. So I have a few sources up here. I'll pause for a second so you can take some photos. The slides will also be available online. But these are some of the more relevant data sources for women in tech and specifically for cybersecurity. So I really enjoyed reading through some of the studies, particularly the bottom one. It's the GISWS, the Global Information Security Workforce Study. And it was carried out by a group of large organizations. They have a pretty large sample size too, which is why I liked reading through that one. But I'm going to show you a few kind of depressing slides about some statistics. And then once I'm done bumming you out, we'll talk about some ways that we can actually change this and some factors that can positively affect us hiring and retaining women. So the first one that I want to look at is pipeline stats. So who here has heard that getting women in security and technology is a pipeline problem? Yeah, some, right? So there is definitely a smaller pipeline of women, but I've found that recruiting out of university is actually a lot easier than trying to get women who are already in the field, who have work experience, to come to your company. So they have different needs, and also women coming out of university, college kids in general, are more willing to try something. They're more willing to give you a chance. So women do make up about 20% of technical fields. For cybersecurity, the BLS data that we're looking at is generally around computer science and computer engineering. Those are kind of the more applicable general skill sets. I also don't really like including statistics about women coming out of university and cybersecurity programs because many of them are newer, so there isn't a long established history or trend that we can really look at. And also, a lot of the cybersecurity programs are offshoots of computer science or computer engineering or IT programs. So while many universities have them, it's really hard to quantify what that program exactly is. So maybe in a year or two, with some of these programs really ramping up over the past 5 years, we'll have some really good information on that. This chart is minority women in various fields. So the second cluster is women in computer science. So the orange is black women, blue is Asian women, and gray is Hispanic women. So there's generally around 2% in computer sciences and around 2% in engineering. That's the very last set of bars on your right. So black women are traditionally very underrepresented. Black men are traditionally very underrepresented in both of these fields. And particularly in cybersecurity, they're very underrepresented. One thing that was interesting to look at was professional associations too. So this is where you would network with people and potentially convince them to come to your organization or transition careers to change from being a computer engineer into a cybersecurity engineer. So this is an interesting population to look at for recruiting. And I looked at IEEE. That's naturally what I think about with an engineering background as like the networking group. And they have a women in engineering group where 2/3 of the members are women and 1/3 are men. And it's great to have supportive men in these groups as well. But the majority of the membership in these types of groups, 50%, it's not really a majority, but the largest population that's represented in this group's membership is in Asia, unsurprisingly. And then also we wanted to look at employment stats. So this is again from BLS. The Society of Women Engineers aggregated this data and made some nice charts from it. But computer programmers and software developers, women linger around 20% of the workforce represented there. But this is a really interesting chart. I mean, you've heard a lot about women who were pioneers in the 60s in computer science and women who were programmers, and then there was a great drop-off. And this chart kind of reinforces that. So the gray line is computer and mathematical occupations. So you can see that there's a steady increase for engineers, chemists, biological scientists. There's a few drops, but generally the trend is going up. And there's about equal representation between between men and women in biological sciences. But now computer and mathematical occupations are kind of going down, and we've reached this plateau here. So it's kind of a worrying trend when you're considering other technical occupations where women are becoming more represented and they're thriving more. So this one is the Global Information Security Workforce Survey. It's a little bit complicated to interpret this, so I'll do that for you. The blue is the percentage that women are represented in the global information security workforce. So you can read this, 1% of the global information security workforce is C-level executives who are female. So that took me a second to read that and make sure that I was parsing that correctly. So here it's about 12% women globally are represented in the workforce, with 5% being non-managerial staff. 5% of the global workforce are non-managerial staff. Here's a little bit more on retention. And as I said, this is a less studied field. So we can get things easily, like demographics, how many years you've worked in a job, but it's more difficult to quantify the reasons why women leave. So I found one good study with information on that, but there were dozens that I decided not to include here because they were asking, they were doing leading questions. They had questions that were phrased like, check all the forms of discrimination you experience at work. That's not really the best way to ask a question, especially about a population that we don't really understand very well. So what I may consider discrimination is very different from what another person may consider discrimination, just based off of what my experiences and understandings are. And the other reason why that's a bad way to ask a question is it kind of leads. So maybe you have experienced those kinds of things, like I wasn't invited to the bar last night. Maybe you didn't think that was discrimination because you've told your coworkers you're not interested in going to the bar. But now you see, oh, I was left out of social activities. Oh, that's discrimination? I guess I feel discriminated against now. So that's not really what we want to accomplish with asking questions like this. We want to understand what people see as a blocker or bias or discrimination and determine how to reduce those things without leading people into a conclusion that we've drawn without having sufficient data. So this is a really interesting chart because this is the years since a bachelor's degree was completed and the percentage of people who studied engineering who are still working in engineering. So 30 years all the way down at the end after they've received their degree in engineering, about 39% of men are still working in engineering, whereas only 19% of women are still working in engineering 30 years down the line. 30 years of experience is usually a technical department head, somebody who's leading strategic initiatives. And the midpoint career is about that 20-year mark. And still, that's where the decline is starting to become really obvious and relevant here. We have 30% of women remaining in the field, whereas there's 35% of men remaining in the field. So this is where people are more likely to start gaining the skills to be that strategic technical leader. And a lot of women say that they're experiencing greater dissatisfaction. This is the millennial age group, 25 to 34. Only 20% of women who leave, though, are leaving to exit the workforce. So who here has assumed that your female coworker left because she started a family or got married? Okay, I wouldn't raise my hand either, even if I thought that, because it's probably not something you want to admit to. Women do leave for that reason, but it's only 20% of them from the study that NCWIT put out on this. So 20% of women are exiting the workforce entirely for some reason or another, usually family or marriage. So where are the 80% going? Are they staying technical? Are they doing the same work at another company? So that was kind of interesting. I have a slide on that too. But 74% of women love their work, but they leave at the midpoint at twice the rate that men do. That's that 20-year mark. So the turnover stats are kind of depressing here. And I promise this is close to the end of the depressing slides. So some women exit and become non-set professionals, so like project managers, things like that, in the same company or a different company, and they abandon their training. Half stay in the field, they just do it somewhere else. ISACA put out a study too, and this is one where I don't want to rag on individual studies, but I want you to consider the questions that would go into a graphic like this. So the first thing that you look at here is, why are women underrepresented in technology? My question is, according to who? So when you're reading through a lot of these studies, if you don't see the questions that are supporting them, it's very difficult to understand whether the conclusion is going to be valid for your group or organization. So one thing here is tech leaders and role models are largely males. That's not something I particularly care about, to be honest. And that's my individual opinion. But I don't need there to be a female chief information security officer for me to want to work in a security group. What's important to me is that I'll be evaluated fairly and that I'll be able to work on interesting things. So you have to kind of read these and understand where the data is coming from. So I'm not saying that that's what they did here on this graphic, but this is the kind of analysis that you want to do when you're considering whether to use this as the foundation for making changes in your organization or not. So they also say there's a lack of work-life balance. Who here can do remote work? Yeah, that's like more than half of the room. So remote work doesn't mean work-life balance, sure, but it does mean that there's some flexibility in your job. So you can leave for 20 minutes, go pick up your kid, and then continue work for 20 minutes longer, as long as you're not interrupting a meeting or something like that. And then educational institutions do not encourage girls to pursue tech careers. Who's heard of a girls' tech or security class? Who's heard of one advertised? So if you had a kid and you wanted to bring your kid to a camp, you've heard of one, right? So of course, 10 years ago, it was very different. So of course, this is something that's still in the front of our minds. Nobody's encouraging women to get into this field. That's rapidly changing, and it's really exciting to see that rapidly change. The other thing on this slide is 1 in 5 organizations say that they're not committed to hiring and advancing women in tech roles. It's that far right bottom pie chart. I would really love to meet the company that admitted to, I'm not committed to this. Because that's, maybe I need to have a few words with them. Maybe some of the audience folks need to have a few words with them. And then also, here's these top 5 barriers experienced by women in technology. And again, I want you to ask, according to who, right? So lack of mentors, lack of female role models. Again, personally, for me as an individual, I don't really care about this, but many women might, especially if they're coming from like a heavily female field. So, for instance, I didn't go to school for information security. A decade ago, I was in school for finance and accounting. And there were a lot of women in finance and accounting. There were female partners at the firms. I knew a lot about women that were in that field. And I didn't feel like I needed a female mentor. But coming into information security, and I was one of the only ones, then, maybe having a female say, yeah, I get treated fairly here would have been cool. Women also say that there are unequal growth opportunities compared to men and unequal pay for the same skills. I'll tell you right now, if unequal pay is the only problem that you have in your organization, you are very, very lucky, because it's really easy to change a number. If you can move budget around, it might take time, but if you can acknowledge and change a number, it's a lot easier than changing a culture, right? So this is again from the Global Information Security Workforce Survey, and this is things that women experience that are forms of discrimination. So there's unconscious and overt discrimination here. Again, that varies very greatly. So it would be interesting to see what the question looks like that says, overt discrimination, examples include this. But then we're getting into the territory of leading questions. So a really good way to ask questions like this, if you're going to do a survey like this for the people who you work with, is overt discrimination, and then explain what the overt discrimination is. And then we can try to quantify that and ask about it again later and see if that particular factor is being reduced. Some things are a little bit easier to ask, so like tokenism. Oh, well, she's the woman, so we need her to be in the picture too. That's what tokenism is essentially. That's a little bit easier to say, but again, it's not something that somebody might consider discrimination until you point it out. There's also unexplained denial or delay in career advancement. This is a people issue. If the organization has really mature processes around evaluating people and tracking performance and progress, maybe it's you didn't meet your goals. It could be because, I don't feel like women are leaders, or I don't feel like women are X, but it's not always the case. So again, studies can tell us a lot of information about the populations that were sampled and how they answered specific questions the way that they were phrased, but it doesn't always mean that this is going to apply to all people. Studies don't account for the exceptional, right? And then here's one slide on pay. Since a lot of people ask me, what does the pay gap look like in cybersecurity? Here it is. The pay gap has closed significantly for upper level executives. So that's people with chief in their title and also like senior directors. But for non-managerial and manager level roles, it has widened a little bit. So women are slightly underpaid compared to men. The pay gap in cybersecurity generally, depending on what data set you're looking at and what types of companies you're looking at, is much smaller in cybersecurity than it is in other areas of technology. So I'm going to show you some not science. So we did some kind of science and some is science. Here's some not science. A lot of conferences have women in tech panels. How does Twitter feel about women in tech panels? And a lot of people still say they're positive and they help. Okay. There's a big debate around should we have women's only classes or girls only classes. And I was pretty surprised that 60% of people, at least in my friend group on Twitter, they're saying female only classes are not okay at any age. Don't do that. Quick note on female only environments. So there's a lot of contradictory research and wisdom here. So the wisdom says that if there aren't a lot of women, let's get all the women together who aren't in this field, teach them, and then put them into the fields. Okay? I mean, that's one way you could do it. Generally, what the debate is over is the amount of experience the female has in the field and how old they are. So there's a lot of debate around what the age cutoff should be. So for instance, very small kids hopefully have not developed a lot of very strong opinions about what men's work is and what women's work is. So it shouldn't be weird for them seeing girls sitting next to them doing the same robotics project. But then if they're teenagers and the boys have always taken computer classes and the girls have not, then maybe, or should we separate the girls to get them up to speed and then put them in a class together with boys? So there are a lot of studies on this. A lot of them contradict each other. I'm not going to put them here because that's its own talk too. That's more the getting women interested in cybersecurity piece too that I don't really want to go too far into today because it'll kind of take away from everything else that I want to talk about. But if you're interested in this and you're interested in encouraging women in your life to get into cybersecurity, I really encourage you to go try to do some research and uncover some of this research yourself. I can give you some leads on it, but it's interesting to read. I have a piece that I blacked out because I cussed and Blackhead said I can't cuss. I might still cuss. Why do you think women don't get into cybersecurity or computer science? So this is another one where unfamiliarity and no interest, I'm not sure I agree with it. Who agrees that women are unfamiliar or not interested in cybersecurity? I promise nobody will beat you if you raise your hand. That's okay. It's okay to have opinions. So this is something that's a really common perception. And you may come from a place where women are just not interested in computers. All the women in your family are not interested in computers. My mom's not really good at computers. So it would be easy to assume this if I wasn't in the field myself too. So I want to talk about 3 main areas where women may be blocked from staying or coming into an organization. And that's hiring, retention, and promotion. So for the next, I guess, half of the talk, I want to go through factors that block one of these things and how you can try to quantify some of those factors. So this is the applicant life cycle. We've all done job interviews in here at some point. So this is generally how it goes. Some companies will do like another manager personality type of screen between the technical screen and selected for the job. But generally you have a recruiter's set of interviews, you have people who work in the group set of interviews, and then there's selection for the job. So the first blocker is women don't see my job posting. That's a pretty easy thing to fix. You post it where women are looking. Where are women looking, Ash? Great question. So there are some women's groups here at Black Hat. One of them is Women's Society of Cyber-Jitsu. There's also WISP. OWASP has Women in Application Security. They're all fantastic groups, and they can tell you where women are looking. They have their own job boards, but also there are clubs at colleges. There's Society of Women Engineers. There's CCDC, where women are involved, and you can reach out to them that way. It does involve a little bit more work than anyone know what spray and pray is? Yeah, a lot of recruiters will do that with job descriptions as well. They'll put the ad out and it's like, okay, we're going to put it everywhere. Hopefully somebody will see it. When you're trying to get a population that you don't have a lot of in the industry and you don't have a lot of in your company, you have to try a little bit harder to target those people. Another thing that you could do is have a sourcer or people who work in the department go find people who might be interested in the job. So you find some women or you find some minorities who are interested in the field already and say, hey, I saw that you're interested in this. I saw that you're doing this. I saw that you're studying this. Have you thought about job opportunities? When they decide to apply, one of the biggest blockers that I hear about is language in job descriptions. Who has heard about gendered language, like male and female language in job descriptions? So there are some things that really turn off a lot of applicants. This is not just women. This is, your job description is confusing. It has a list of like 25 technologies, 5 of which have not been around for 9 years, so how can I have 9 years of experience in them? Anyone seen that? Yeah, those are pretty fun. So that's not really the best way to write a job description for anybody, right? So we want to make sure that we're putting things in job descriptions that are actually relevant to the role, and then also explain what you're going to do for the individual in the company, in the role, to help them grow, support them, and make sure that they're performing so that they can succeed in their career. Also, company reputation. I'm sure you can think of a few companies who've been called out pretty publicly and scathingly over the past couple of years for not treating women super well on their engineering teams. I'm not going to name and shame here, but if you have that reputation following you, it's going to be much harder for you to proactively go out and get these candidates, even if you're willing to do that work. When you're selected for the recruiter screen, it's usually the recruiter training and judgment. From the 40 or so recruiters that I've talked to about this, the biggest complaint they have is that the hiring manager gave me this checklist. They say, they're requiring us to only hire people with bachelor's degrees. They're requiring us to only have people who study computer science or who have a similar job title at another organization. Well, if there aren't a lot of women in the field and they don't necessarily have that training experience or job title, then it's going to be a lot harder to increase the women in the pipeline. And sometimes you do need a very specific set of experience, but I can think of very few jobs in information security where transferable skills don't apply. For instance, somebody who's a very good programmer could also be pretty good at testing applications because they understand how the code works. So it's just training them that little bit further about, you thought about writing code, now let's think about ways people could break into your code, right? And then also recruiter training, a lot of them say they want me to evaluate technical skills, but I'm not technical. I don't feel comfortable evaluating this, but people are asking me to. So that's really not a great idea either. So one way to get around this is have the recruiters have questions to ask the candidates and have the candidates kind of self-evaluate if the recruiter is not super comfortable asking those technical questions. But also just stick to things that are important before you pass on to the hiring team. So if there's a specific location or if there's specific attributes of the job that are just something that you cannot budge on, have the recruiter ask just those kinds of questions. When they're selected for the technical screen, again, it's the recruiter saying, yeah, okay, they probably have the skills, let's pass them on. But it's also the hiring team judgment and evaluation criteria. So a lot of you, when you interview, you're probably not going off of the same exact questions for every single candidate. And I'm not saying you need to do that. In fact, when I see something on a candidate's resume and it's something that I happen to have experience in, I want to push on that thing. I want to ask questions to help me evaluate what other things they're interested in and what they can do, but I also want to push on that and see how deep their expertise goes. So that's a good thing to do. But you also want to make sure that you're evaluating people with the same criteria. So, for instance, we're hiring for a person who does X. It's cool that they do Y and Z, but we're really interested in X. Did we test for every single candidate, regardless of how we tested it, can they do X? Whether it's through sending them a technical screen, so they're supposed to solve a problem that's directly related to the job role, or we're asking questions around that specific thing in addition to other stuff that we're asking. And then finally, when they're selected for the role, you have to make the selection as the hiring manager or the hiring company, but they also have to accept your offer. And a lot of the time, it's not money. It's how you were treated during the candidate process. So one thing that I hear from women in particular is that, man, I mean, they seem really smart, but they were also really condescending to me. That interview felt more like they were trying to prove how much they know versus trying to test what I know. So I feel really bad about that, and I'm not sure how I'm going to be treated on this team. Or there weren't any women in the hiring process, and I asked them if there were any women on their team, and there weren't any. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Why aren't there women here? And again, you don't have to have a bunch of women in your company to get women to join your company. We just want to be reassured that we'll be treated the same and evaluated the same. And that's very difficult to do when there aren't women in the company. So I do want to talk about affinity groups a little bit. Affinity groups are everywhere in tech. The way that I'm using affinity group here is kind of like a friend group. Your friends are more likely to look like you than to not look like you, or share characteristics with you than not share characteristics with you. Because how do we meet people? Oh, I met them at that football game, or I met them at this club. We have things in common. And because the industry is very heavily male-dominated, if you're getting referrals in from people who are joining the team, it's pretty likely that those referrals are also going to be men. So a few ways that you can kind of break out of this is diversify some of the networking that you're doing. So go to receptions like the diversity reception or QueerCon at Black Hat. Of course, they're not going to have every single person who isn't basically a white dude in tech, but there's going to be a way for you to build that relationship and network. And a lot of you in your local communities also have hacker groups or colleges close by where you can go and try to find these groups. And it's really important that it's not just recruiters or HR people. I like recruiters. I had to talk to a lot of them over the last couple of years to do some of this research, but I don't really want to hang out with them if I'm being completely honest all the time. I'm a nerd. I'm an engineer. I want to work on engineering stuff. I want to talk about technical things. And a lot of people have a lot of really cool things to talk about, but I want to find groups of people who are interested in the same things and hopefully get some more women and other underrepresented groups in those groups as well. Another thing that I hear about a lot is that women need female mentors. That's not true. You need to find the person who's going to help that person as an individual grow and advance. So I don't really need a female director as my mentor if she's doing something completely unrelated to what I'm working on. If she happens to be very technical and she's working on intelligence stuff, then yeah, that's great. I really want to talk to her and I want to learn about, what training I should be getting. But I don't need to have a female mentor just because I'm female. Just like men don't need a male mentor just because you're male. Like, that sounds kind of silly when I reverse that, right? And a lot of these stereotypes about women are also kind of sound a little silly if you reverse them. Here's a little bit of advice for job descriptions, because this is another thing that people ask me about a lot. There's this gender decoder that I've used a few times and I really like it, but it basically just has masculine and feminine language. But generally you want to focus on what the applicant will actually be doing day to day and explain to them in the job description how we're going to determine whether you're qualified for the role or not. So I found this job description. It's from Splunk, and they've been really working hard on their diversity initiatives. This is kind of contrary to I'm not going to name and shame. I will name and praise, though, when somebody does a good job. But they have two sections in this job description. It's what we provide and what you provide. We provide growth and mentorship, stable, collaborative, supportive work environment. I don't know anybody in this room who wouldn't enjoy having a stable work environment. I prefer a stable work environment. I want to be able to collaborate with my peers. I do want balance, and a lot of men want that too. So it's things that are appealing to lots of people, not just women want this. And then what you provide, there's only a few things that are actually necessary for this job role. Experience with C++ is necessary, and you should be willing to learn more. So the only thing that probably the recruiter would ask me, I don't know, I didn't apply for this job, but if you're going to apply for this job, probably the only thing you're going to test me on is my C++, and then my ability to learn more. Am I curious? Am I interested in figuring more stuff out? You may ask me some things around SSL, TLS, SAML, whatever, common security knowledge, but you're not going to drill into that too much. You just want to make sure I generally know what I'm doing. And this is, the job role for this is kind of a security engineering sort of role. That's why I picked this one. But this is one of the best job descriptions I've seen. I mean, who would want to apply to this job if you were looking? Yeah, it's okay. Nobody raise your hand. It's fine. We're all employed. So the bottom line here is, this isn't perfect, but this is a good example. There are specific things called out. They do point out that we provide mentorship and stability and collaboration, and a lot of people appreciate these things. So here's kind of the dicey subject. Like, it's really hard to hire women and get them in the pipeline, but then I hear, oh, well, we got a bunch of great women, but then they all left after a year or two. So, why are they leaving? I'm like, well, let's talk about this a little bit. This is another one where the studies contradict each other greatly. So I hear, again, in France, there was a study about why women love being in cybersecurity in this particular company. It was an academic program, actually. And they enjoyed the flexibility. They felt that they were paid the same as their peers. Some countries, like Iceland, has a law now where you can't pay men and women differently. So pay is not a factor where we have these kinds of regulations. But the hours and location, the relationships with your coworkers, those kinds of things are important. Another one that I hear about a lot, particularly from women who are kind of mid-level experienced engineers, is that I'm not getting the same training as other people in my group. I put in a training request and it was ignored. I wanted to learn more about this and I wanted to grow my technical skills, and they said it wasn't necessary because I'm already doing a good job doing the exact same thing I do now. But I want to grow and I want to move up, or I want to expand my technical knowledge. I want to become an architect, so I need to know more about other technology, and I'm being blocked from doing that. Something that affects men and women universally too is evaluation criteria. So, you can feel like you're doing good work, but if you don't know how somebody else is evaluating your good work, that could be kind of stressful for anybody. But another thing there too is the personal aspect of it. So if we don't have a formal way to recognize what people are accomplishing versus what other people are accomplishing, it's really difficult for me to understand why somebody would be promoted over another person. So one example of that is, oh, well, this person never comes into an office. So it's really hard for me to understand what they're working on. It's like, well, you can ask their manager what they're working on, or you can look at the quality of their work or their assignments, and you can compare it to what other people are working on. Just because they're not physically with you doesn't mean that they're not performing as well as other people. It just means you don't see them very much. And it's really easy to fall into this pattern of out of sight, out of mind. I did touch on marriage and motherhood a little bit and how that could affect, how women could potentially leave the workforce. So again, it's only about 20% of women who are leaving the workforce entirely, and only some of them are leaving because they got married or became mothers. So again, the wisdom may make you feel like there's a lot more who are leaving for that reason. That's not super true, especially it's 2018. There are a lot of working mothers now. It's not really a taboo thing anymore, at least in the United States. So the role of marriage is less researched, specifically in the cybersecurity field. I found 0 studies on this. Like, if I'm married, does it affect my promotion potential or my tenure or anything like that at the company? So I did find one on the American Association of University Women, AAUW, about tenure track jobs and assistant professor jobs. So being single was a good predictor for one, being married was a good predictor for another. Doesn't mean it's a requirement. Again, statistics, it's this predicts this. Correlation isn't causation. So, there's a relationship, but we need to explore it more to really understand causality, as with anything. So the final thing that I want to get into is this framework. So the framework is to identify factors. We want to identify things at each stage of somebody's relationship with the company. So hiring into promotion, retention, those kinds of things. And we also want to identify the stakeholders who can control or access information around those things. So again, super simple chart. Useful factors are often not quantitative, they're qualitative. So they're quantitative things that we can measure, like how many women are in the department. But saying we want to increase women in the security department by 5%, any means necessary, that's not going to be super effective. We want to make sure that once we get them, we can support them. Once we get them, we'll evaluate them fairly, right? An outcome by any means necessary is not really going to be a lasting outcome. And so the framework is basically the way we would set up any kind of test. We want to set up a test, we want to collect the data to support the test, and we want to track and evaluate the results over time. So you choose questions from each category for each stakeholder group, and you list known and suspected factors, but you also want to determine who's going to be surveyed, what the survey method is, and who's going to own the data. Some things you can just pull out of like an ERP system. You can get pay data, demographic data, things like that. But it's harder to get information around reasons why somebody was promoted. You have to go and ask the managers for things like that. Also things like exit interviews. A lot of HR departments really don't even keep those. So there are central places to store notes on exit interviews, but a lot of people just don't store them or keep them or read them or review them. So you've heard the common wisdom there about people leave managers, they don't leave jobs. So the exit interviews are probably a wealth of information around how there might be unfairness in your company. Not always, because again, working in an office is interpersonal relationships as well as the work that you're doing. But you may have a view into those interpersonal relationships and where some of the breakdowns are if you're not really keeping track of this. And then, of course, you want to survey your employees. The best way to know about what a group is experiencing is ask them, right? So you want to have a baseline round, and then you also want to track and identify new factors over time. So this is the stakeholder framework piece of this. These are the different stakeholders that we have. Can you tell I got a business degree? Yeah. There's colors on there. I usually make horrendously bad PowerPoint, so I'm pretty proud of this slide. No one helped me. So there's executives, department heads, hiring managers, employees, HR, and recruiting. So HR and recruiting would store like your performance database. They'd also store attrition reasons and disputes. You know, I got reported to HR, ha ha ha, that would be stored with HR, right? And then they also control the recruiting practices. Department heads and hiring managers have the training priorities under them, hiring criteria and promotion criteria. They're the ones who are going to determine you need this bucket of skills to do this job at this level, right? Executives have the overall metrics, but also the reputation and direction. I want you to really focus on the reputation and direction. If there's any executives in here, you know, VP, whatever, reputation and direction is set at the top, right? All comes from the top. So if you have kind of this feeling at the top about, well, we don't really care about hiring women, or we don't really care about hiring diverse candidates, we just want to get people in to do the job, then it's going to trickle down, right? And then employees can control and understand their own impressions. They can make their requests and they can give feedback, but you have to be in a position to listen to it and use it effectively. So employees here actually control very little here. I mean, the squeaky wheel is the one, right? We all hear about the squeaky wheel. So, you know, I'm sure there's a few people here who are happily guilty of being the squeaky wheel, who want to make things better. But there are a lot of people who also don't speak up when they're treated unfairly. We want to make sure that we capture that somewhere. And we also have these factors, you know, hire, retain, and promote. So your end goal with this, again, I mean, it's going to be completely different for every organization. I can give you some guidance, and I have some guidance out, but we have basically you're doing favorably or unfavorably with each of the categories. So executives are doing favorable things to influence hiring of women, is what this chart says. And HR and recruiting are doing unfavorable things to influence the hiring of women. They're not posting places where there are heavy concentrations of women. They're not proactively trying to message women. They're not trying to do other things. They're asking about things that women don't care about, or they're saying things in interviews that are inappropriate. I'm not saying that's a common thing. It isn't, but just an example. So you want to see at a high level and also at a department level what things these groups are doing to influence each of these groups of factors. So really quickly, I want to do a couple of sample questions that you could ask. For hiring, you want to see where your job's posted, things like that. One thing that I tell hiring managers to do is go look at the resumes for people who were rejected at the recruiter level and then also at the level after the recruiter and see, okay, was there anybody who I would have wanted to talk to? Let's change the criteria we're giving to our recruiters. What questions are your recruiters asking? Are they asking some standardized things at the front? When possible, are we evaluating people based off of their skills? Not necessarily their education or years of experience, but do they know how to do this thing or do they not know how to do this thing? That's going to be pretty important. For retention, equal rewards and recognition, pay. Are employees treated the same after taking leaves of absence? That kind of stuff is pretty interesting to ask about. Do employees get credit for their work? Is there somewhere where we record what everybody's doing at a high level so that we can understand what they're actually working on? And that way we can kind of stack and rank. Stacking and ranking is not always about the individual like contributions technically. It's about how they're working with the team, how they're trying to contribute to cohesion and everything like that too, but the work is a part of it. And then our managers trained to notice harassment because legally there's no retaliation and you have to keep complaints like that confidential, but I'm pretty confident that if I asked, I'm not going to, how many people felt confident going to HR and complaining about something and they wouldn't be stigmatized or somebody wouldn't find out. I don't think a lot of people would actually feel that way. There's some companies that are really, really good at this, but from talking to female engineers in other companies, a lot of them just really wouldn't feel comfortable reporting that. Or they think, oh, well, it's not really sexual harassment. I just felt kind of uncomfortable in this situation. It's like, well, if you don't tell anybody, we can't really try to prevent it from happening if it is something that's keeping you from doing your job and interacting with your coworkers positively. And then also for promotion, I'll go through these. Those are all up, so you guys can get a photo of that. But sponsorship and mentorship come up a lot in hiring papers. Harvard Business Review puts a lot of emphasis on sponsorship and mentorship for underrepresented populations that you're trying to get into a field. But really, what does that mean? Are we identifying people? Are we making sure that they're getting the right training and that they're making the right relationships in the company to carry out their career goals? Do we understand what their career goals are? Are we discussing their career goals with them? And then are leadership roles and other things advertised internally? And are employees encouraged to apply to those internal roles? And then finally, if there are training opportunities, is everybody getting a fair shot at the training opportunities? Maybe just a little application form or something like that. And then finally, do executives have access to the data and metrics to determine where these gaps are? So here's a quick plug for WC and Tech Chat, Women of Color in Tech Chat. This is where all my stock photos come from if you want to put some women in your stock photos. But with the license they're released under, here I am telling you where they come from. Cite your sources, university. So I believe I have about 2 minutes for Q&A. I'll do probably one question in here. It's really hard to see up here, but please. I think there's some microphones here too. Now everybody stare at him, so. Sorry, I can't tell what you look like. I don't know.
Yeah, a few slides ago, it looked like you were saying that employees were acting unfavorably in the retention category, but you didn't really talk about that?
Of course. So it's not employees are acting unfavorably, it's employees are doing things to unfavorably influence factors that would influence retention. So one example of that would be employees are not going to expand their networks. All of the referrals that they're making are people who are from their network and look like them. And it's not something bad or something that they should be punished for. It's just our goal is to increase minority populations in our hiring. So they're not actively doing this, therefore it's unfavorable. And depending on what the organization is, you may not even rate categories. It rates some groups in these categories, but a lot of organizations should. Another thing that you could look at for employees for retention is, are people trying to train each other? Are people trying to work together? Things like that. So again, it's one thing that's very difficult to quantify because it's interpersonal relationships, but generally, are we contributing to a positive work environment somehow? So obviously, like, if somebody is saying a lot of really sexist, awful things or a lot of really racist, awful things, they're not contributing to a positive work environment. So that's why you might have an unfavorable mark in that category if it's widespread. For individual employees, one person shouldn't tip the needle either way. It should be organizational and it should be at a high level. But yeah, no, we don't want to interpret this as employees are doing bad stuff to retain women. They're not positively contributing to this category. And it could be neutral too. It doesn't need to be favorable or unfavorable. You can have neutral. All right, so that's the end of my time. Thank you so much for coming to this. I'm really excited that so many people are interested in this. Thanks.